The lift doors finally parted to a flurry of activity in a small sub-bay where I was to catch another shuttle for the next leg of my journey. There were quite a few stormtroopers moving at the double quick. A deckhand told me my original flight had been cancelled, but directed me to your ship. I walked over and spoke briefly to a couple of you on the ramp as we were loading up. It was then that I caught sight of the shadowy figure on the gantry, and got the strangest feeling of recognition. I was convinced it had to have been my father. I know he asked me not to contact him out of concern for me, and I am sure he has been the one quietly moving me around over the years based on inside intelligence as the situation required. I just wish he could reassign me publicly based on my record. The fact that my new group was full of veterans was a relief. Half of you guys were asleep by the time the engines fired up. In my mind's eye, I watched as my father, the hangar bay and the Devastator, were left behind as we fell away, making that long, stomach-dropping arc toward Tatooine. He took a moment to catch his breath, looking into the licking flames of the fire. I am finding it hard letting go of my training. In the Guard, the closer you come to the inner circle of power, the less you are allowed to trust. You retrain to watch everyone, even each other. It's different out here. Being a trooper in the field, your unit is all you have. You have to depend on each other. That's the way it should be. Just bear in mind, and know that it's nothing personal, but until I am more comfortable. I am watching each of you closely. We all must have reasons why we were assigned here. It certainly isn't the best post in the Empire. We all glanced warily around the fire at each other. None of us really knew all of the others, but we would need to rely on each other to make this work. Rogue walked away to check in with Captain Tyrell and his men to let them know of our progress. The rest of us settled a bit more for the night. I wiped the fine, sandy dust from the lenses of my bucket as I sat on the edge of the ramp. As I finished and lay back on the inclined metal plank, I rubbed my head and stared up into the massive expanse of stars looming overhead. Somewhere up there was the Devastator, and Lord Vader, awaiting the recovery of the stolen data recordings. I closed my eyes and almost immediately drifted off to sleep. Across the darkened dunes, far away from our small, fire-lit encampment in the modest dwelling of an aging knight, after 20 years buried under several layers of personal belongings in a small chest, the lightsaber that had been used to slay Jedi in the final hours of the Temple's grandeur, to slaughter younglings and masters alike with no mercy, this elegant weapon lay poised, ready to return once again to the hand of a Skywalker. The stillness of the morning air was almost deafening. I was still reclining on the metal boarding ramp of the Sentinel and had been watching the suns come up when Topaliv sat up and rubbed his eyes. I knew we weren't far from the edges of several of the local moisture farms. We had flown over them on the trip out. I wondered if the other crawler had ventured in that far to peddle their droids to the local farmers. Rogue moved and sat up now as well. Noticing a flashing message indicator on his comm link. He noted it was from Tyrell as he listened to the recording. Damn. He's cutting my search team in half. What is it? Said Falker. Tyrell had another shuttle dropped from the Devastator, overnight. It looks like most of his team was recalled. The destroyer is returning to DS Station and they're going with it. He's going to intercept us this morning and pick up 2 of his men from our flight crew along with Taka. Dan's Blade. Drag and you to help him with his search efforts. I don't mind working for Tyrell for a while as long as we find the missing data. Just don't leave me with him. I don't think I could take the guy for long, said Falker, and he slapped Rogue on the shoulder. Come on, let's get moving. Right, said Rogue, understanding perfectly. We have a lot of ground to cover, but I think we're close. I can feel it. The suns were climbing into the sky and the dropship cruised along, as we searched for the remaining Jawa sandcrawler. We were skirting the edges of the rocky Junland wastes when Tyrell's shuttle intercepted us. We slowed and landed as his ship circled and descended to the sand in front of us. Rogue sent 5 of his troops and 2 of Tyrell's troops out of the Sentinel, double-timing it over to the extended ramp of the shuttle. Tyrell's voice crackled in Rogue's headset. We'll regroup back in Mos Eisley. Good hunting. He never exited his ship or showed his face. We watched as our troops disappeared up their boarding ramp and the shuttle climbed back into the sky, heading down one of the ravines into the wastes. Rogue exhaled under his bucket. He's trouble. Asterisk. The ground below became dotted with moisture evaporators, spread out in every direction as far as the eye could see as we flew over several sprawling moisture farms. Finally, we came across the remnants of the signature tread trail of the lumbering, mechanical Jawa transport vehicle. After following the tracks for some time, we came over a rise and saw the sandcrawler we had been searching for. The pilot banked hard to the right, circling around to the front of the crawler and then coming around to hover beside it. The clanking treads of the large vehicle slowed and then stopped moving altogether, as the transport lurched to a halt, steam venting from various ports around the base. There were several moments of silence, then a side hatch opened and a ramp lowered to the ground. Several Jawas came cautiously wandering down the ramp through clouds of venting gases to the sand. Our pilot lowered the hovering sentinel to the ground and opened the rear hatch. We all filed out and circled around to face the Jawas, leaving him at the controls of the ship. 0600 moved ahead of the rest of us and already had his helmet translator switched on as he approached the leader. He was speaking with him as 4120. Felth and I came walking up. It was clear the Jawas were anxious as they conversed with us. The leader was scratching his head, appearing to be confused and nervous as he tried to remember the things 0600 was asking for. He says he thinks he remembers picking up 2 bipeds, one of them found out in the dunes, but they sold both just yesterday. One was sold to a moisture farmer and the other to a repair shop in Anchorhead. He's not sure which farm, but thinks it may have been the last one before the Dune Sea. Tensions were running high. We had been looking for this missing droid now for 2 days, and Lord Vader was not patient or forgiving. Felth spoke up, his own patience with the little creatures wearing thin. We're most likely halfway back to Mos Eisley by now. That's a fair bit of backtracking. Is he sure he has it right? Is he sure he isn't hiding something? Maybe we should take a look on board the crawler, and he drew his blaster, pointing it toward the group gathered at the base of the ramp. The little Jawa was not sure what to make of Felth's comment, or having the blaster pointed at his friends, and became agitated. Several other Jawas on the ramp began jabbering away. Silently, a small portal in the hull of the sandcrawler opened and a nozzle protruded past the protective metal armor plating. Tupolev noticed the barrel pointing in our direction, and knocked Rogue out of the way, as the Jawas in the crawler opened fire on us. Tupolev and Rogue rolled out of the way as the bolt seared past, burning into the already hot sand. Felth swiveled and drew his E-11 blaster as the little leader Jawa moved out of the line of fire and ran. He took a shot at the little creature, missing. I turned and blasted the little creature off his feet as he ran away. The sandcrawler's guns blazed again several more times, as we dove for the sand and took precise aim, returning fire at the turrets and the tread drive mechanisms, blasting them in a shower of sparks, rendering the crawler defenseless and undrivable. 4120 ran toward the crawler and up the main ramp, blasting several Jawas out of his way and hurling a handful of thermal detonators inside. He turned and ran back toward us. Jawas scurrying down the ramp of the vehicle, behind him. He dove for the sand as the devices erupted in a series of violent concussive blasts inside the hulking vehicle. Rogue had not seen him toss the detonators and was turning toward the crawler just as the explosions ripped it apart. He was knocked off his feet as the whole structure blew outward, armored metal panels hurtling off the vehicle. They flew out and rained down into the sand of the desert around us as the superheated gases and the concussion of the detonator thrust the massive armor plates outward with deadly force, killing anything within the blast radius. I stood up and turned to see the damage. Just as our pilot lifted the Sentinel ship from its gear and fired into the command deck of the crawler. We were all firing on the fleeing Jawas now, avoiding their blaster fire and taking them out one by one. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The hovering Sentinel settled back into the sand once more. The wisping wind carried the unmistakable, nostril-burning stench of charred Jawa flesh as we moved in close to the burned-out vehicle. Our rifles were now slung on our shoulders and E-11s drawn for close combat. ETZ and 0600 led the way up the ramp into the colossal structure. 4120 and I followed up the ramp as Felth. Tupolev, Rogue and 1265 set up a perimeter around the base of the crawler, watching all sides for any possible approaching onlookers attracted by the smoking ruin. It was dark inside. Smoke drifted through the small corridors, and the remnants of dead Jawas were everywhere. We stepped over them and moved higher into the vehicle, making our way around the sites where the detonators had done their damage. Footing was not good, as most of the ramp had been blown away. The bulkhead alongside it had been pierced, exposing the main cargo bay. Several of the detonators had gone off inside and it was now a tangle of metal, droid parts and smoke. I kicked the dome from a red R5 unit out of the way as we moved still higher to the command deck and the steering room. Here we saw the damage from the Sentinel's blasts. The hull had been breached by the green burst of energy from our ship's guns. Anything in the path had been vaporized. Black, acrid smoke billowed out of sparking, burning electronics and swirled out the gaping holes in the hull into the desert wind. We all began to search for transfer documents showing any recent sales. A wounded Jawa clawed at 4120's leg. ETZ blasted it once in the head to end its misery. 0600 pulled the lifeless bodies of 2 dead Jawas off a small console and was sifting through some of the documents that had been spread out beneath them as he looked for evidence of the droid sale. There were records showing 2 sales today so far. One for a machinist droid to the Toshi station in Anchorhead, and one prior to that, to a moisture farmer, the last farm out before the Dune Sea. The paperwork showed a transfer of 2 droids, a protocol droid and an astromech. He grabbed the paperwork and turned to make his way out of the burning structure. "I've got what we need. Let's take a closer look outside." The smoke had cleared somewhat and we could now see the bodies of Jawas littering the sand around the base of the crawler. Rogue flipped on his comlink and contacted Captain Tyrell, asking that he check out the machinist droid sold to the Tosh station in Anchorhead, while we doubled back to the moisture farm. The winds were picking up as we walked back to the drop ship. 4120 and I were discussing how to leave the scene, when 0600 and Topolov walked over discussing the sales documents. I turned to him. "We were just talking about this scene, and how we should leave it. If the locals see Imperials slaughtering Jawas, they're going to know something is up and start asking a lot of questions. Questions we don't need, and won't be allowed to answer. If we're going to be stationed here, we need to camouflage this scene, lead the trail away from us." The others nodded in agreement. 0600 turned toward the group. "ETZ, untether the Bantha. She just became very important to the mission. *****. An old woman stepped out of a small building to cross the street, when she stopped herself, and checked both directions carefully, then continued cautiously across the street. Anchorhead was relatively quiet this morning, no damned kids screaming by in their speeders, skyhoppers or swoops. Catching sight of a small group of Imperial Stormtroopers making their way toward her, she hurried across the street into the building there, and closed the door, watching them nervously as they passed by. Falker had already made a sweep of the perimeter of the buildings at a small repair shop further down the street known as Tosh Station. When he was confident of the number of occupants and their positions, he silently waved to Tyrell and the others to advance to his position. They assembled near him and then fanned out, taking up positions around the station. Windy laughed, taking his pool shot as Deke watched. "Can you believe Skywalker? First I catch him out in their tech dome listening to an academy recruitment tape while checking out applicant information packets, and then he comes blasting in here yesterday all charged up about a battle over Tatooine. What a joke. Nobody would ever fight for this place. I doubt anyone even knows we still exist way out here, yeah. Wormy S got a big imagination, all right," said Deke, "he has spent too much time in the hot suns fixing vaporators. Hey, did he come by for those power converters Fixer set aside for him? If he doesn't, I want them. You got the last pair." Deke and Windy were arguing over who got the last set of power converters as they played their game, and Kami was curled up sleeping in the chair behind Fixer's parts piled desk when the abrupt invasion occurred. Tyrell burst through the front door of Tosh Station with his blaster drawn as Taka. Dans and D. Drake flooded in after him, herding the startled 3 young kids to the center of the room. Falker and Blade escorted a young mechanic in from the maintenance bay in the next room. His sleeves were rolled up and his arms dirtied with grime and vehicle lubricants from the speeder he was working on. Tyrell spoke. "Now that we have your attention, we will search your building." "Lays Lonosner, did you recently purchase a new droid?" Fixer was shaken, scared and confused as he answered. but tried his best to look calm in front of Kami and the others. "Call me Fixer, everybody calls me." Tyrell slammed a fist down on the desk. "I don't give a damn about who you are." "What about the droid?" a shaking Fixer replied. Yes, I did. I did. I mean we did. I mean, Merle did. Merle Tosh. He owns the place. He told me to get a new machinist droid, but he paid for it. I bought it from a Jawa sandcrawler that came through here yesterday. What does that have to do with anything, though? I've bought and sold a lot of droids, and never had the Empire care about it. Tyrell gave a small nod. Falker grabbed and folded Fixer's arm high up behind his back, slamming Lonosner's head down on the desk, spare parts clanging to the floor. Fixer winced in pain. Kami recoiled a step, covering her mouth, her face betraying her feelings for him. Tyrell stepped closer and removed his helmet, leaning down a bit, sweat dripping from his nose. "Show us the respect we deserve and cooperate." He was speaking just over Fixer's head as his gaze lifted and came to rest on Kami, "Or we will leave your repair station in smoking ruins and take all that is precious to you." Kami, shaking, took a cautious step back as Tyrell's eyes looked her up and down, but Drake was there with a blaster in her back to keep her from escaping. "Take the girl and the others outside, but leave Lonosner here," barked Tyrell. "I want this place turned upside down. Now, *****. 0600. Rogue and a disappointed Topaliv moved around the scene of the sandcrawler and dropped several of the gaffi sticks he had collected in random locations amongst the twisted metal plates and scattered droid parts. "I'm keeping one of them," said Topaliv, holding on to the last gaffi. Meanwhile ETZ rode the Bantha past the crawler several times, leaving several side-by-side rows of tracks in the sand to give the appearance of many Tuskens riding past. He continued this exercise until the ground appeared trampled by many of the lumbering beasts moving in a herd. Then he walked her back up the ramp of the Sentinel and slipped off her back, snapping her restraints back into the large ring in the floor. The area now had the look of a confrontation between the Tuskens and the Jawas. We should be able to successfully avoid any of the local moisture farmers raising questions, and by taking the purchase orders, we had effectively eliminated any evidence of the droid's existence here. Taking a last look around the site, we retreated up the ramp of the drop ship and lifted skyward. The pilot moved away slightly. Then rotated back and fired several shots, scorching the ground where our landing gear had settled, leaving no traces of our presence behind. We banked away from the smoking ruin heading off toward the edge of the Dune Sea, and a moisture farm owned by someone named Lars. Chapter 9 The Lars Place. The sand, rock and windswept dunes making up the barren landscape beneath us slid past quickly as we now flew with a purpose toward one of the moisture farms we had passed earlier this morning. Hopefully the fugitives would soon be in our custody, the stolen data extracted and returned to Lord Vader, and the droid or droids destroyed. I unclipped my macros from my belt and snapped them on, scanning the horizon for any sign of the moisture farm. Nothing yet. I found myself wondering what could be so important to have rattled Lord Vader so, and why he had been careless enough to allow the data to be stolen by rebels in the first place. The small domed entrance to the Lars dwelling finally came into view and the Sentinel flew in low, giving us a good visual scan of the farm's layout. The main living quarters and most of the other structures were built beneath ground, with only their roofs protruding up to break the flat, sandy skyline. All of the buildings appeared to have subterranean corridors that emptied into a common, open-air courtyard pit. The dewbacks groaned and flipped their tails around nervously as the Sentinel settled to the ground, squarely in the center of the now familiar mechanical tracks that had kicked up the sand in front of the dwelling. The rear doors hissed open, and the gusting, fresh air rushed in to replace the overwhelming stench from the onboard livestock. We walked the length of the rear ramp to the ground outside and circled around toward the domed entrance to the desert homestead. A scruffy, aging male dressed in well-worn, but presentable desert wraps came walking out to meet us. ETZ and Topaliv walked to the edge of the pit and peered down into the open courtyard below. The man's eyes followed them as they walked. Felth hung back a bit with 1265, carefully watching the rest of the farm. 4120. 0600 and I stood with Rogue, who walked up to the man as he verified the name on the purchase order. "Mr. Owen Lars. That's right." Owen nodded. We have information that tells us you purchased 2 droids yesterday from a Jawa sandcrawler, is that correct? The man squinted a bit, crossing his arms, visibly unnerved by the sudden gathering of Imperial troops on his farm. Maybe, but why the hell would the Empire care if I buy a couple of droids? What's bringing you out this far? This early to question me about buying a droid or 2? Rogue took a step closer to the moisture farmer. I'll ask the questions. Owen narrowed his eyes even more as the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He had always thought it would come to something like this one day. First the astromech spewing gibberish about Obi-Wan Kenobi, and now this. He had watched over his step-brother's child for all these years. Knowing in the back of his mind that one day, the Empire that had claimed Anakin would be back to claim his son as well. The fact that Kenobi had remained on Tatooine in hiding, carefully watching over the boy from a distance, had long foreshadowed this day and the events that were now beginning to unfold. Owen felt sick in the pit of his stomach. His mind raced to Beru, down in the kitchen preparing the day's food. Luckily, Luke had gotten an early start with both new droids on an errand and would then be off to repair condensers on the South Ridge and not returning for some time. Owen now feared for himself and his wife as he tried to settle back a bit. He had sheltered and protected his nephew from the Empire and crazy Ben Kenobi for too many years to have it all unravel now because of a droid searching for the old wizard. He wished Kenobi and his master, Qui-Gon Jinn, had never come to this place. Anakin would have grown up here with his mother, both slaves to Watto. And yet, he would have been far away from the treachery that became the Empire, the treachery and deception that had ultimately twisted him into the cold darkness he now was. Owen's mind was reeling with the chain of events stemming from that fated emergency landing, and the explosive, destructive wave that had swept across the galaxy as a result. Now culminating in this meeting with Sandtroopers at his farm on this windy morning. If any one small piece of the puzzle had been different, he might not be in this situation now. With any luck. Luke had already had the astromech's memory flush done. Owen spoke. Yeah. I bought 2 droids yesterday from those filthy, greedy little Jawas. They dumped the grimy droids, took my money and headed off in that direction, he said, pointing across the Junland wastes toward Anchorhead. Rogue nodded in agreement as Owen finished speaking. I'm sure they did, but I need to see the droids you purchased. One of them may have something that was taken from us, and we want it back. Owen scowled. I don't know what you're looking for, damn it, but they aren't here. They've been taken to, Mos Espa for some refurbishing. I paid good money for those blasted droids and they both still needed work. Rogue turned to 4120. Search the farm, we need to be sure they aren't here. UNO 600 check the power generator. Deckard. I want you. ETZ and Tupolev to check the living quarters. 1265, search the surface structures. RXO nodded and motioned for the rest of us to follow him. I already told you they aren't here, said Owen, uncrossing his arms. Rogue reflexively responded, as did the rest of us, stepping back and leveling our blasters at the scruffily bearded moisture farmer. He took a step back, slowly raising his hands. I have no weapons. Rogue visually scanned the old man and nodded again. The rest of us backed off and walked toward the entrance dome and the steps leading down into the home. We'll just wait here, Mr. Lars, while we see what my troops turn up. Owen felt control slipping away and the sickness he felt in his stomach began twisting into a thick knot as the armor-clad Sandtroopers descended the stairs into the homestead his father had built below. 1265 headed off to inspect the roofs and surface structures behind the courtyard pit. ETZ and Tupolev went off in the direction of the living spaces in search of other family members. ETZ followed a drifting smell from what must be a food preparation area, and I went toward the garage. Tupolev uncovered a tidy, modest sleeping room for Mr. Lars and his wife, and a second, disheveled sleeping room, which showed signs of someone having been there the night prior, and having left in a hurry. ETZ stepped quietly through the hallways until he heard the churning of food processors and cookers. Luke, is that you? Did you forget something? Came a voice from the next room. He descended a few steps and found an old woman preparing drinks for a morning meal. She turned, expecting to see Luke in the doorway, and instead saw ETZ, with his blaster lowered at her. She screamed and dropped the container she held in her hand. The blue Milky liquid inside exploded all over her feet and the floor as it hit the ground. She stood shaking, terrified and transfixed by the sight of the Imperial Sandtrooper in her home. Blue milk dripped from her clothes and the counters. ETZ spoke. "Hold it right there. I don't want to hurt you. We just have a few questions for you and your husband. Who is Luke? I descended a short flight of stairs and crossed a narrow gridded gantry through a dark garage area where it appeared several vehicles were stored. There was an empty, open bay with some tools and parts lying about, and then a second bay with a T-16 Skyhopper parked in it, hardly the norm for aging moisture farmers. I continued on and the gantry emptied out into a grungy, well-worn tech dome, a repair center for condensers, evaporators and other farm machinery, including droids. The room had the smell of heavy oils, burnt wiring and exhaust residue. I stepped down to the gridded center deck plate in the center of the stone room and slowly looked around. Protruding from another parking bay adjacent to the oil bath facility was the nose of a multi-passenger V-35 Landspeeder, a bit more in line with our residents' age and driving needs. I poked around, looking over the repair benches as lights silently winked on and off on the wall control panels. The oil bath was calibrated to accommodate a plunge depth for a human-sized, bipedal protocol droid. Then a hooked tool and a small, round lump of metal on one of the repair benches caught my eye. I removed my left hand from under the muzzle of my blaster, and picked up the small object. It was a restraining bolt, the kind used to keep droids from wandering off. I looked around the room again and pulled off my bucket, holding the bolt close to my nose to smell it. There was a strong burnt odor and a loose black powdery residue, indicating it had been removed recently. I slipped my bucket back on and headed back toward the surface to show Rogue and the others what I had found. I stepped off the top step and out of the domed doorway into the sand. 4120 stood beside Rogue. Felth, Topaliv and 1265 now formed a line between the small gathering and the Sentinel. ETZ had found a woman and brought her out. She stood beside her husband, shivering with fear as the cool morning wind blew over us. Rogue had his blaster trained on Lars and ETZ had his blaster leveled at the small of the woman's back. I walked closer, rolling the restraining bolt over in my hand. I could hear Rogue speaking to them now. "So then, what you're telling me is that you did buy the droids, but they never even made it inside your place. You sent them right off to Mos Espa for refitting and refurbishment." Owen nodded. Then ETZ spoke up. "Who is Luke? Your wife called out to Luke when I came walking in on her." The moisture farmer looked flustered for a second. Then recovered with his reply. "Luke was a hired hand that we just lost a week or so ago. He worked on the evaporators. That's why I needed the droids, to fill his spot." ETZ was not convinced. The woman seemed to think he had forgotten something and had come back for it. "Doesn't sound like an ex-farmhand to me." The whole situation was beginning to just not smell right. I looked down at the restraining bolt in my hand and spoke up to the group as Topaliv stepped closer. "I found this in their tech dome," tossing the bolt to 0600 who looked it over as I continued. "It's been recently removed from a droid, and their oil bath was last calibrated for a bipedal protocol model." Rogue turned to stare Owen in the eyes. 4120 and Topaliv looked at each other as the latter spoke up. "We didn't see any droids down there except a worn-out old power droid and a broken treadwell." Rogue turned his attention back to Owen. "I'm going to ask you one last time. Think carefully before you answer. Who is Luke, and where are your droids?" Owen glanced at Beru as she shook in fear, staring back at him. He turned thoughtfully back to Rogue. "You've already decided to kill us, haven't you? You can't have any witnesses to what you're searching for. We're too much of a liability. Aren't we?" Beru remained silent. She knew they had to protect Luke, or everything they had worked for over the years would be for nothing. She lunged at the thermal detonator on Topalev's belt, unclipping and activating it, holding it high in the air over her head. All of our blasters leveled at the old woman as Felth and 1265 stepped closer, blasters raised. She shook and trembled, as we backed away from her and the clicking detonator. She and Owen backed away from us toward the domed entrance to their home. "You can't have Luke, and you won't be killing any of us over a droid. It's you who'll be dying today," and, as she moved to throw the detonator at us. 0600. 4120 and I blasted through her forearm at the wrist, severing it from her.